Alrighty, so the goal of this video is to populate our UI with the dynamic quote text and quote author, as well as enabling our new quote button and our Twitter button as well. So let's dive right in. The first thing is, back in our HTML file, we can see that we have several IDs on our elements here. We have our quote container, our quote, our author, our Twitter button, and our new quote button. So we're going to need to target these in our JavaScript in order to interact with them or in order to take user input. For example, every time we press our new quote button, we want to be able to trigger a specific function, in our case, our new quote function. So to do that, we need to go to the very top of our script.js file, and we're actually going to create a corresponding constant for each of these elements. So we're going to write it out in camel case like we've been doing before. That means that the first word is lowercase, and then any next words are capitalized. So in this case, quote container, the C in container is capitalized. And this is going to be equal to document get element by ID. I can select that and press enter to autocomplete that. And then in brackets, in single quotes, we're going to pass in the ID that we had there, quote generator. Make sure that your IDs match, quote container. I already made a mistake there, but that goes to my point. Make sure that your ID in your HTML matches the one that you have in your JavaScript, or else you will have an error saying this element is undefined. So we'll change that to quote container. Okay, and I'm actually just going to copy and paste this 4 more times here. And now the first one we're going to do is quote text, capital T on text there. And this is just going to target our ID of quote. The next one is going to be author text, and this is going to target our ID author. Then we have our Twitter BTN for button, capital B on the BTN there. This is going to be to our Twitter ID. And then lastly, we're going to have a new quote button BTN. So again, capital B there. And this is going to be to our new dash quote ID. Okay, so now that that's all done, the next thing we want to do is actually jump back to our HTML, and we're going to remove our placeholder text here, our Buddha quote. So we'll remove the text, and we're going to remove the author as well, because they're about to get dynamically added in our JavaScript. So we can save both of those things, jump back to our script.js file, and what we want to do is we want to remove our console log in our new quote function, and instead we want to actually populate the text content of our author and quote elements. So first we'll look at author text. That's our constant that we just created right here. And this is going to set the value of the text content. So this will allow us to pass in a string that is then shown in that element. And we're going to use quote.author because we want to just get the author, not the entire quote object. And we'll do a similar thing below for quote text. And this is also going to be the text content. This time it's going to be quote.text. So let's save that now and check it out. Okay, perfect. So we can see that it's working. We have a dynamic quote here. If we refresh the page, we see that we have another dynamic quote. Awesome. So that is working. That's great. So if you remember from the last video, when we looked at the local quotes array, you might have noticed that some of them had a null value in the author field. We want to be able to replace that with a string of unknown to make sure that there's always something there. Instead of having a blank space here, it'll say unknown if the author is empty. So that's a check we're going to have to do in our new quote function before we actually assign this value here. So I'm actually going to cut this line, and I'll make a little bit of space here. I'm going to comment out a title, and this is to be to check if author field is blank and replace it with quote unknown. Okay, and we're going to use an if statement here. So if quote.author doesn't exist, so we can actually simplify this to just be exclamation mark. So that means if there is no quote.author, you could also do if quote.author equals null, but this is a more simplified way of writing that out. Then we want our author text.text content to be equal to, and then we're going to pass in our string of unknown. And then in our else statement, so this means if we do in fact have a quote.author value, and then we can paste in what we had before, the text content will be equal to the quote.author. Okay, and conversely, another thing we want to change is if our quote text is really long, we actually want to apply our long-quote CSS class, meaning that we're going to change the font size to be smaller on longer quotes and have it be the normal font size on every other quote. So we'll comment out a title for this as well. So we're going to check the quote length to determine the styling. So we're going to do another if statement here. If quote.text.length is greater than, for now, let's just put it at 50, just to show that it's working, but we will change that number in a moment. And then inside of these curly brackets, we want to have quote text, so this is our actual element, dot class list. So this is going to add a CSS class using class list.add. And then in brackets and single quotes, we're going to pass in the name of the CSS class. In this case, it was long-quote. Else, so if the quote text length is shorter than whatever number we put here, feel free to modify the numbers if you like. We're going to, instead of adding that CSS class, we're going to remove that CSS class. And we're going to leave this at the bottom because we still want to set our text content with the value of the quote one way or another, but this is determining whether or not we want a smaller font size or a regular font size. Okay, so let's save that and check it out. Okay, so you can see that that's already working there. Our font size has gone down. It's closer to the size of the author itself. If we refresh, see if we can find a short one. Okay, so there's a shorter one, and you can see in this case that the quote text is bigger in this case. So we'll just go back, and I actually prefer to have this at 120 characters, but it's up to you if you want to make it bigger or smaller, depending on at what threshold you want to have a smaller font size for your quotes. Okay, so that's working great. The next thing we're going to take a look at is we need to get our buttons to start working. And we're actually going to start with our Twitter button first. So there's a link here that I will provide in the course, and this is how we're going to actually be able to tweet a quote that we have on Twitter. So it's actually going to pre-populate a tweet with the quote text and quote author. So in order to do that, we're going to need to copy this URL here. And eventually what we're going to do is we're actually going to pass the query parameter of text. And then inside of that text parameter, we're going to pass in a template string that features our quote and our author values separated by a space and a dash. Okay, so let me show you what I mean by that. If we go back down to the bottom here, we'll actually make this function at the bottom. We're going to comment out a title first, and this is going to be to tweet a quote. And we're going to create a function called tweet quote. Okay, and then we're going to have a space, and then our curly brackets, press enter. Then we're going to create a constant called Twitter URL, and this is going to be equal to a template string. So I just want to highlight the difference here. So a template string uses backticks. This is the button right below your escape key. This is different than single quotes. So that's single quotes right here, and this is backticks. You can see that it's kind of slanted. So make sure that you're using backticks and not single quotes for this. The reason being, we're going to paste in our Twitter URL that we copied, and then we're going to have a question mark to show that we're going to have a query parameter here, and then that parameter is called text, and then that's going to be equal to, and the reason we're using a template string is because a template string allows us to pass in a variable, and it will be converted into a string. So in order to do that, we're going to use $, and then curly brackets, and you can see here that that turned blue. That's how you know that it's working correctly. And in this case, we're going to pass in the quote text.text content. So that's what we're setting up above. And then After that, we're going to have a space and then a dash and then another space. And then we're going to do the same thing, $, curly brackets, and this time it's going to be author text.text content. And then after the backtick, we're going to have our semicolon here. So I'm going to use Alt-Z to word wrap just to be able to see everything, but that is all existing on one line. And then the next thing we need to do is just window.open, and this is going to allow us to open a window using our Twitter URL, and we'll also pass in another parameter with a comma, and we're going to pass in single quotes underscore blank. And using this single quotes underscore blank is going to allow that Twitter window to actually open in a new tab. Okay, so lastly, to get our Twitter button to work and our new quote button to work, we're going to need to add some event listeners. So these generally go at the bottom because you want to declare your function before you call it. So in this case, we'll comment out a title here for our event listeners. And the first one is going to be on our new quote button. So new quote button dot add event listener. You can see I can use the arrow to select the second one here, press enter, and then brackets, single quotes, click. So we want to target a click event, and then comma, and then we're going to run the new quote function. So we don't need to have curly brackets on this quote itself. We just need to pass in the function name. And then we'll do a similar thing for our Twitter button. So Twitter btn, that's our constant, and then dot add event listener, bracket, single quotes, click, comma, and then this time we want to target our tweet quote function that we just made. Okay, so let's save that and check it out. Okay, so we're going to start by trying out our new quote button. So remember, before we were actually just refreshing the page. Okay, awesome. So that's working. And it's working really fast, pretty much instantaneously. This is because our API quotes array is now local once we fetch it the first time, and that's why it is loading so quickly. You can see that our unknown has worked as well in this example. So this would have been blank before, but because we passed in that string of unknown, we have that showing up there. Awesome. And lastly, we just want to make sure that our Twitter functionality is working as well. Okay, awesome. So you can see that we have our quote here, we have a space, and then we have a dash, and then we have the author, which in this case is unknown. Okay, perfect. So that's working exactly as we wanted to as well. Awesome. So in the last video, we're going to go over adding a loader animation, though in our current setup, you will likely only see it at the very beginning when we are fetching the quotes from our API, because after that, we're just pulling instantly from our local array of quotes. But we'll check that out in the next video. I will see you then. Bye for now.